In 1979, Miami was the most dangerous city in the United States. Not dangerous in the way cities sometimes get labeled dangerous, where the statistics are bad but the streets feel mostly normal. Dangerous in the way where bodies were showing up at such a rate that the Dade County Medical Examiner's office had to rent a refrigerated hamburger truck from Burger King to store the overflow. A refrigerated hamburger truck. Because the morgue was full. In a single year, 1980, Miami recorded 621 murders. And a significant portion of those murders traced back, directly or indirectly, to one person. Not a cartel boss operating from a compound in Colombia. Not a mafia don with decades of infrastructure behind him. A woman from the slums of Medellin who had been running criminal operations since she was a child, and who, by the late 1970s, had built a cocaine trafficking operation so sophisticated, so violent, and so profitable that law enforcement spent nearly 2 decades trying to dismantle it. Her name was Griselda Blanco. They called her the Black Widow. And that name, as you're about to find out, was earned. Griselda Blanco was born in 1943 in Cartagena, Colombia. She grew up in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Medellin, a city that was already, even in the 1940s and 1950s, defined by extreme inequality, political violence, and a street economy built on survival at any cost. Her childhood, by every account, was brutal. Her mother was abusive. There was no father in the picture. There was no money, no stability, no safety. She was reportedly involved in petty theft by the time she was 11. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because what Griselda Blanco learned, not in school, not from any mentor, but from the raw experience of surviving in one of the most violent urban environments in South America, was a lesson that would define everything she built later. The world responds to power. And power, at its most fundamental level, is the ability to make other people afraid of what happens if they cross you. She absorbed that lesson completely. By her early teens, she was already operating in street crime. By her 20s, she had married, and allegedly had her first husband killed when the relationship became inconvenient. Hence the nickname. She wouldn't stop there. She eventually had 3 more husbands. The outcomes for all of them were not good. Yeah, the pattern was consistent. By the mid-1960s, Griselda had started building something more structured. She moved into document forgery, producing fake passports and visas, which she used both personally and as a service for others moving between Colombia and the United States. This wasn't just a side hustle. It was infrastructure. Because the people who needed fake documents in 1960s Colombia were, almost universally, people moving product. And Griselda was positioning herself at the center of that network before the cocaine era had even properly begun. She eventually moved to New York, set up operations in Queens and the Bronx, and started bringing cocaine into the United States in a way that, for the late 1960s and early 1970s, was genuinely innovative. She reportedly pioneered the use of specially designed lingerie with hidden compartments for smuggling cocaine on flights from Colombia. Customs agents at the time were not searching underwear with particular thoroughness. The operation worked. The product moved. The money started flowing. And now, this is no longer a street criminal running small-time scams. This is an architect. She was arrested in New York in the early 1970s on drug trafficking charges and fled back to Colombia before trial. But by the time she returned to the United States, this time settling in Miami, the cocaine market had transformed entirely. The late 1970s were, economically speaking, the gold rush era of cocaine in America. Demand was exploding. Middle-class and wealthy Americans were treating cocaine as a recreational luxury. The stigma was essentially non-existent in certain social circles. The profit margins were extraordinary. Buy a kilogram in Colombia for a few $100s. Sell it in Miami for $50,000. The market was there. The money was there. What the market lacked was reliable, organized, large-scale supply chains. Griselda Blanco built one. She established distribution routes from Colombia into Miami that operated with the kind of logistical precision that would impress a supply chain manager at a legitimate corporation. Speedboats running product through the Florida Keys at night. Couriers carrying kilos and luggage through Miami International Airport using the document forgery networks she'd been building for a decade. Warehouses for storage. Accountants for the money. A hierarchy of distributors who moved product further into the country. At the peak of her operation, She was reportedly moving over 300 kilos of cocaine per month into the United States. Per month. The revenue from that, conservatively estimated, ran into the tens of millions of dollars annually. In 1970s and 1980s money, she was, by any objective measure, running a major corporation. The difference was the enforcement mechanism. Because this is the part that separated Griselda Blanco from every other trafficker operating in the same space. She didn't just build a business. She built a reputation. And that reputation wasn't built on business deals. It was built on fear. People who crossed her didn't get warnings. They disappeared. She ordered hits on rivals, on informants, on people inside her own organization if she suspected even a trace of disloyalty. She didn't wait to be sure. She acted on suspicion. Because in her world, waiting to be certain meant giving someone enough time to act first. And this is where things escalate fast. Because Griselda didn't just approve violence. She normalized it. Inside her operation, violence wasn't a last resort. It wasn't an escalation. It was the first tool she reached for. The message it sent was deliberate, and it was consistent. There is no version of betraying Griselda Blanco where you walk away. That message, repeated enough times with enough bodies as evidence, meant she rarely had to deliver it twice. She is connected, directly or indirectly, by law enforcement estimates, to over 200 murders across her career. 200. And the city started to feel it. By the late 1970s, Miami was living through what law enforcement would later call the cocaine cowboys era. And that's not a dramatic label invented after the fact. That was the lived reality of a city that had essentially become a war zone. Shootings in broad daylight, drive-by assassinations in traffic, bodies left in parking lots, shopping centers, hotel lobbies, and highway shoulders. There were documented cases of gunfights erupting inside Miami International Airport. The kind of public, uncontrolled violence that, in a different context, would be described as a military conflict. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. The DEA was understaffed and underfunded for the scale of what was happening. Local police were, in some cases, outgunned, in other cases, outright corrupted by the sheer volume of money flowing through the city. And a significant portion of that violence, not all of it, but a significant, documented portion, traced back to Griselda's network. Because she wasn't just reacting to a chaotic market. She was, in part, creating the chaos. Using violence not just to protect her operation, but to reshape the competitive landscape. Every rival that disappeared was one less organization competing for her routes, her distributors, her territory. The violence was, in the coldest possible sense, strategic. Yeah, this wasn't a criminal who got out of hand. This was a business decision, made repeatedly, over years. And the method her organization became most associated with, the one that changed how contract killing operated in Miami and eventually spread far beyond it, was the motorcycle assassination. 2 men, 1 bike, no warning. The driver would pull alongside a target, in a car, walking on a street, sitting outside a restaurant, and the passenger would fire. Fast, clean, gone before anyone in the vicinity fully processed what had just happened. No pursuit. No witnesses who could describe more than a motorcycle and 2 helmets. The method was efficient in a way that other approaches weren't. Cars could be blocked. Foot pursuit was possible. Drive-by shootings from cars drew more attention, left more evidence, were harder to escape. Motorcycles solved all of those problems simultaneously. Griselda's sicarios used the method so frequently and so visibly that Miami police developed specific terminology for it. A Colombian necktie referred to one execution method associated with the cartels. Motorcycle killings became so synonymous with Colombian trafficking organizations that detectives, upon arriving at a scene with that signature, would note it in their reports as a presumed cartel hit before the investigation had even begun. The tactic spread. Other organizations adopted it. It became, through repetition and imitation, a standard feature of cartel violence not just in Miami, but in cities across the country and eventually back in Colombia itself. A technique that started as a logistics solution inside one woman's organization became a defining feature of an entire era of organized crime. And now, this is no longer just impact. This is legacy. By the early 1980s, the DEA and Miami-Dade law enforcement had made her a priority target. This was not a straightforward investigation. Because Griselda Blanco was careful. She rarely handled product directly. She communicated through intermediaries. She moved frequently between Miami, New York, Colombia, and California. She had enough money to buy lawyers, buy silence, and, when necessary, buy time. She had been building this operation for over a decade. She knew exactly where the pressure points were. By this point, there's no version of this story where she outsmarts everyone forever. The DEA built their case slowly. They flipped informants inside her network. They tracked financial transactions. They documented the murders, connecting the motorcycle killings, the shopping mall shooting, the hotel room executions, back to orders she had given. In 1985, Griselda Blanco was arrested in California. She was charged with multiple counts of drug trafficking. The trial was complicated. Key witnesses recanted, others were killed before they could testify, and procedural issues delayed proceedings for years. She was eventually convicted in 1994 and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She served time in a federal facility in California. While incarcerated, additional murder charges were filed in Florida, but key witnesses died or became unavailable, and those charges were eventually dropped. She was deported to Colombia in 2004, after serving approximately 20 years. She lived relatively quietly in Medellin for the next 8 years. On September 3, 2012, Griselda Blanco was shot and killed outside a butcher shop in Medellin. She was 69 years old. The method, a single motorcycle riding assassin, was exactly the technique she had popularized in Miami 3 decades earlier. If there is a more fitting end to this particular story, it's hard to imagine what it would be. Here's what the Griselda Blanco case actually demonstrates about how criminal organizations work and why it still matters. Her operation succeeded not despite the violence, but partly because of it. The economics of illegal drug markets have no legal enforcement mechanism. You can't sue someone for stealing your cocaine shipment. You can't take a rival to court for undercutting your prices. The only enforcement available is the kind Griselda specialized in. Economists who study illegal markets call this the violence premium. The idea that in criminal economies, the willingness and capacity to use extreme violence functions as a form of capital. It buys compliance. It buys loyalty, or at least the behavior that looks like loyalty. It creates a competitive moat that most rivals are unwilling to breach. She also demonstrated something that the drug enforcement community spent years struggling to process. That the assumptions baked into law enforcement's mental model, that major criminal organizations were run by men, structured like traditional mafias, and operated according to recognizable hierarchies, were not universal. Griselda Blanco didn't fit the profile, which meant she operated for years with less scrutiny than she deserved. She built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She ran it for nearly 2 decades. She changed the geography of drug trafficking in the United States. She changed how assassinations were carried out in an entire city. And she did all of it from inside a world that, by every cultural assumption of the era, should not have had a place for her at the top. She made a place for herself anyway, by any means necessary. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When we talk about people like Griselda Blanco, the scale, the intelligence, the discipline it took to build what she built, is there a version of that story that commands a certain kind of reluctant respect? Or does the body count make that conversation impossible? Because a lot of people answer that question differently, and I want to know where you land. Leave it in the comments.